Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. My name is Tom and today we'll be talking about open access books. To help us with this, we're joined by Deirdre Duffy, who's a senior lecturer in sociology at Lancaster University. Deirdre is the author of a new open access book titled Abortion Trail Activism, the Global Infrastructures for Abortion Access. Deirdre, thank you very much for joining us.
Not a problem, Tom.
Just to get us going, please can you tell us a bit more about yourself and your book?
So my name is Deirdre Duffy and I'm a senior lecturer in sociology and I specialise in global social inequalities and gender at Lancaster. And I work in the area mainly of reproductive justice and global abortion activism. So one of the kind of my key area of focus is in a restrictive regime, how do people access abortions and the role of kind of activist networks in that. So the book has kind of been the product and the outcome of quite a long period of research, starting with a focus in Ireland and Liverpool and what kind of called the Liverpool-Ireland abortion corridor, where historically women will have travelled for a lot of gender-based reasons to Liverpool, and Ireland's kind of noted as a key destination for abortion seekers. But I was interested in the activist movements who would support that through kind of care practices and really what would see kind of everyday actions, but are really significant. And then from that, it expanded outwards into research on, these kind of pathways, and really hadn't been the focus of academic study. They're really peripheral, and in public consciousness, you have quite a lot of awareness of the Jane Collective, for example, in America, or part of the Green Wave, the Acompañantes movement in Latin America, and obviously the Irish movement and things like the Abortion Support Network and Safe Abortion Access and the Abortion Dream Team. Sorry, there are a lot of organisations, but there've been a lot of activists and allies in the space, but the focus really had always been on the woman seeking abortion or the person seeking abortion rather than what is this activism. So it kind of been framed as a slight response to a restriction. But what I was interested in is actually, these activisms, they don't have a point at which they start. They don't have a specific, there's no one size fits all. It's very contextual. Yeah. And also increasingly what you see is actually they lay the framework for what abortion services in a liberalised state looks like. So the kind of parameters of that debate. The book really focuses on using a particular kind of name for them, which I propose a little bit tentatively because I don't want to be an expert. Like all academic sociologists, I don't want to be an expert in anything. And I said, use the idea of a trail, because one of the interesting thing about the word trail is that trails have a spirit, right? Yeah. But they have a lot of different connotations depending on where you stand globally or in terms of, your role. So, say in business and management, you talk a lot about trailblazers, but actually no one person makes a trail. A trail comes into being because of lots of different people over time. A trail in, thinking about kind of things like pilgrimages or I enjoy hiking a lot. So hiking trails are kind of romanticized into these really nice, freeing spaces. And there's, writing in philosophy on lines of desire, trails as following your spirit and this kind of spiritual. But at the same time, then you have county lines, right, which are trails too. And in sub-Saharan Africa, you would have panya or rat roads across borders. And that kind of thinking through what makes a trail led me back to, what makes abortion trail activism? Is it that it's illegal? Is it that it's dangerous?
Yeah.
Is that it's backstreet? When really these movements, they're not invisible and they're not, unsafe. Actually, some of the modes they use are more safe.
Yeah.
And during COVID, we saw how the world adapted to self-managed abortion, right? So it stopped being this kind of like, really desperate thing that people did in these pill networks to actually this is what care should look like. This is what access should look like, right? So you have these kind of different characteristics. So I tried to kind of find some way to discuss that a bit as an entry point to it. And the kind of conclusion that I try and come to is like, well, there's some things that define and kind of share this form of activism, these different movements. Like they come together to care for people and be caring. They're concerned about access. So what does it mean to be able to access something? How do you make something accessible? The work that involves. Some of their work involves repairing trails that have existed before, maintaining trails. And then the other is what you would call kind of a prefiguration. So imagining a future that is slightly more radical.
Yeah.
And then that provides kind of an interesting jumping off point to how like a liberal narrative of what abortion care should look like actually frames the trails in ways that aren't true to it. So would see it as, one of the arguments for having a illegal framework, for example, that permits the laws is often, as shown in Ireland, through that political narrative that, the alternative is backstreet, people using these awful, awful things. So the liberal narrative of pro-choice actually had made the trail dangerous, but the trail hadn't necessarily in and of itself been the dangerous part of this picture. Yeah. Do you see what I mean? So it was that kind of interesting, moments you thought, or made me think, and hopefully will make other people think about, well, what happens when you call for, say, the state to make a trail safe? What does that mean? Do you lose its spirit? Should you embrace its spirit? Does it have a spirit? Yeah. so it's kind of quite speculative, but for a while I thought about it as a bit of a love letter to abortion activism, but I think that's too egotistical. But yeah, I mean, sorry, I could talk about this all day.
And so what inspired you to publish your book as open access?
Well, I'd always wanted to, and I was always conscious that I was writing about something that actually I'm not part of. And I haven't had the experience of it. So I have not accessed abortion. I have grown up in a country where abortion was hyper restricted and where trails were really part of going to see an aunt abroad is so much part of the Irish cultural imagining that the first scene in Derry Girls, they introduced the character James. I don't know if you've seen Derry Girls.
Yeah, I've seen Derry Girls.
I think everyone has seen Derry Girls. I hope so. Maybe that's what they'll get out of this podcast. Rewatch Derry Girls and watch out for this line where James, the cousin in it, is introduced as, this is my cousin James, my aunt Deirdre, who went abroad to have an abortion but never did. So it's so much part of that. But I've never been part of that experience. So I've never spoken to activists for that reason. I've always spoken to them as like an academic. And then there does come something when you're writing about a really live and meaningful and important, like it's more than an intellectual activity, that the people who are involved in creating that and doing that, I think I wanted them to at least have the opportunity to read what I was saying about it. And I knew that they would, because of the costs of academic publishing, that could not happen without an open access publication. I mean, it's not a perfect solution to that because it's still in English. But you know, maybe that's the next kind of thing to think through.
And can you walk us through the process of publishing open access? Did it differ from your experiences of publishing non-open access?
I mean, a bit yes and no. So the actual, like, you know, having something supported as open access obviously costs a lot of money. So what's different is you're asking, like, obviously this pilot is fantastic, but I'm aware that it's a privilege to be part of that. So you're, in a way, publishing open access when you have a book in your hand or you're submitting the final manuscript, there's a little bit of bureaucracy that is different, because whereas for my previous books, the focus would have only been on, like, okay, submitting, done. This adds another little bit to it, to, like, copyright, what am I signing away from? And then there's, so that's a little bit different. The other thing, I suppose, is a bit more, you know, even though I wanted people to be able to read this, you write a book as an academic, I think, especially where it's, you know, engaging with theory and history, and it is quite, like, it's not meant for the general public to consider. It's not written in that way. What becomes slightly different when you publish open access is that you become slightly aware that you're making available something that people financially will be able to read and access, but it's very conceptual and it's quite dense in places. So there's that kind of internal, I suppose, little bit of do I need to rewrite parts of this? Do I need to add more? Do I need to revisit? But that would make it a different book.
Yeah.
So that would be, and I don't think I would ever feel comfortable or be the person to write that book, because, it's not necessarily my story. So there were kind of practical things that differed a bit, and then there were kind of, and I suppose, book end stage questions about editing, whether to go back and revise things. And then I suppose quite a big one is that, you know, things like the cover. This seems like a really silly point, but, like, the object, the physical book, you kind of have to accept that not everyone is going to access it in that form. So so the parts you like that, say earlier before it became, you know, part of this pilot and an open access book, it wasn't designed to be open access. So the thing I was excited about more than anything, this sounds really embarrassing, is like what the cover was going to be. I was heavily invested in this, and especially I will say that one of the reasons so heavily invested is that publishing on abortion in the media and imagery, it's not great. Yeah. And I was kind of aware, I'm very much aware of, like, what the front cover would look like, and make sure it didn't fall into any tropes that are, like, so obviously stigmatizing and so obviously counter my own politics, but also the kind of critical edge of that. So I was concerned about something, and I had this whole thought process believing that the main version that people would access would either be through the website for the publisher, which they didn't have to purchase in C&C, or in a physical form. But the reality is, now that it's open access, that bit gets it can be bypassed. So it's just like a different, that's different. And yeah, I mean, it does, like, differ in that, you know, that people don't read a cover to cover of an academic book. I certainly never do. Spoilers. Yeah. I mean, I don't pick it up and start at the beginning and go all the way to the end. Sometimes I do, but That's not always how you approach it. So you already know that people are only going to read like one chapter. But the benefit of open access is it is user-centric. So they can openly just go, oh, I'm not interested in the rest of it. And that's a bit different to it. So you become really aware that each chapter needs to stand on its own because they're like micro objects and objects. Sorry if that's too conceptual.
Did you face any challenges or obstacles during the open access publishing process? I know you've touched on a few of them previously, but how did you overcome those?
I think because I was coming at it with a really clear set idea that I was not going to move from. So I can talk, I think what I'll start with is some of the challenge that maybe I could have faced if I was slightly, maybe earlier in my career, still kind of internally debating, and some things that I had a very clear idea. So the challenges that I could have faced, and then the challenges that I did face. And then the challenges that I didn't face just because I was committed by that stage. It was too late. I wasn't. No, it was too far in. It was so. The big challenge is obviously the cost. Like obviously, beyond anything else, is who is going to foot the bill for this. And then as an author, you are giving up. The academic publishing, I know we already has that triple lock where somebody, I'm on an academic contract, so I'm not being, which has research into it, so I'm not being paid to do research. I got a sequence of external funding, so the cost of producing the research not being personally paid. And the only thing, even though it's very small, you have as an author is kind of copyright and those purchasing, and with open access you give that up. So there's a challenge in terms of, are you in a position where you're able to do that? So that's kind of the financially bit. The other one is that where I'm, and this comes down to a challenge I could have faced, is that I do think, even though open access has become more prominent and there is a lot more within the, I'm going to describe academia as an industry because it is an industry, within the business, there is a lot more acceptance of open access routes, of open access publish, and a lot more acceptance that this is both an ethical commitment and the right thing to do, but also kind of an acceptable form of publishing, right? I think that has definitely, the change is still happening. It has been really slow, but much more so now. But there's still a question over whether your work will be dismissed because it's open access, because people don't have to pay for the book. Does the book have value? And I think because I'm at a fairly senior, like I'm a senior lecturer at a research intensive university in the northwest of England. So even though there's always kind of academic cultural capital and intellectual capital, I'm not in a precarious early career position. I'm in a position of privilege, so I'm able to kind of take a risk. But I think one of the big challenges and obstacles in open access publishing is your ability to surmount that risk and potentially, I wouldn't say take a hit, but I think 10 years ago, the advice I very clearly got and even some, so this is an interesting thing, some journals within health research and one journal in particular is Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters, which publishes in multiple languages, includes author processing charges and has for a number of years done that in order to, for scholars in Global North who are in secure positions, and they've done that so they can support open access publishing. So that's been around for a bit, but whenever, I suggested to, say, line managers or research mentors that I was thinking of publishing, they said, that can't be your only publication, because it has to be paid for, and it would be conflated with predatory publishing and not the quality, not the
prestigious,
not the prestige. Yeah, so the intellectual capital that comes with publishing. I think one person pretty explicitly just said, no, don't publish there, even though that is a world-leading journal. So that's a world-leading journal that lots of people read and use in policy. It's written for policy. It's respected in the field because of that pound sign before it and the knowledge of you have to pay to publish with it. I was kind of told, no, that can't be the other one. You have to go for one of these journals, all of which are not open access, right? So that I think is a big obstacle that I potentially could have faced, but because of Lancaster and because this pilot existed, I was able to kind of sidestep it a little bit. But it is still, I think, an obstacle. Being able to get around it, or having enough support from an institution or from colleagues or from peers, from people I respect in sociology, to surmount that obstacle doesn't mean that obstacle doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And that would be my concern. That actually one of the things is I've been able to get over this obstacle course. But 10 years ago, I wouldn't have been.
Yeah.
I might have been, sacrificing quite a bit beyond the £20 in royalties.
And what impact will publishing your book, Open Access, have on potential audiences for your work?
Oh, I think it globally will expand them. So this is one of the really exciting things and why I'm so... I don't think it's going to be, a W.H. Smith's. Because the target audience will remain an academic audience. However, and this is already well documented, Sylvia Tamale has written about this in her works on Afrofeminism and decoloniality. There's a lot of work, particularly from African scholars and Afrofeminist scholars, about the costs of purchasing books and how that becomes a complete impediment to dialogue in a meaningful way. So people, who would potentially, including people who I would like to read and criticise me, I would like them to criticise my take, may never be in a position to read it. So that audience, if it costs money, I'm kind of knocking out people.
Yeah.
So I don't know if this will actually realise in terms of the audience accessing. There's still those kind of, why would they read this book? Written by clearly an academic, for academics predominantly. But I think it opens up a potential academic audience who wouldn't have really been able to access legally a free version of this. So I think it does have an impact on that potential audience, but it still exists in potential, and it would be better if kind of that there was more steps to say guarantee or facilitate that audience. But we've only got acceptance that you should pay for your book to be published. I will say one thing that and this is, there are lots of reasons for this, because the kind of classic trope is the language of academia is English, which is not true. Which is not true, because it diminishes. And I'm just going to speak particularly to my field of abortion activism, reproductive justice. the dominance of English language publications, their consumption, their use, overlooks entirely that some of the most exciting work has come out of, say, Latin America and the Caribbean by academics who predominantly or only write in Spanish, French, or Portuguese, and the dialects and variations thereof to audiences who are in those in Latin America and the Caribbean. So one of the potential audiences that this won't have impacted is the many scholars whose first language isn't English, because it's the open access, even though all of the kind of verbatim quotes and data included the quote from the original language as well as my own translation, and put it that this was my own translation in it, even though I included that kind of multilingual aspect in it, the analysis, the text, the book itself, the open access supports an English language variation. It doesn't support, nor is there any commitment to translation of this work. So a kind of potential audience is still not absent, but it has opened up a greater, I suppose, geographic span. So that's a good thing. Yeah. Baby steps.
And will a print copy of your book be published and sold? And do you know if you'll receive royalties for these sales at all?
Yes. In fact, there will be. There's a hardback and a paperback version. So hardback, paperback, and ebook are published at the same time, which to me is wild, because why would anyone buy the hardback version? So inspection copies I don't think are offered. So, which again I think they should be. Which open access does fix that problem, because some academic texts inspection copies are made available, so people working at universities in the global south or in the majority world can request them, and the charges there'll be sometimes it's a reduction in cost, sometimes it's for free. This was not, inspection copies were not extended to this, so open access kind of resolves that problem. But yeah, there's still physical IRL versions. You can put them on the shelf. I put them on the shelf. Well, I've none left, because you get like a certain amount of free ones. Though they're not really free, because like you wrote it, so surely. So you get your 6 copies, but they're already gone. So I don't actually have a physical copy of my own book. And I can buy it, though at a reduced. I have an author discount, which is. I'm hoping you guys have a physical copy ordered, and I would receive some royalties from that. And if I, say we have a launch event coming up on Monday here, and there's a few launch events planned. There's one in Trinity, there's one in Birmingham, I think. So if I purchased on my author discount kind of 10 copies and brought them along and sold them, I could charge whatever, and receive royalties and the excess from that. So if anyone does buy it, but royalties for academic books, I mean, I have not written. Some people might have done. I'm sure they have, but I think the first royalty for my first book, my first royalty check was like £80, and then it was like the following year was like £10. And so it does. So it's not exactly a way to earn the big bucks. Yeah. That's more a reflection of my work rather than like agreements. So I'll get royalties for those sales, but I'm hoping people don't buy it if there's a free version, to be honest. And also, again, throughout producing this, I have been in a full-time permanent contract. Yeah. So I'm not a freelance author. I've had hours. I've been on teaching and research contracts, so I've had hours in my thing. So, you know, you don't, as an academic on that kind of contract, you don't have to write a book. And sometimes you're told not to write books because in certain disciplines, people don't read them. And it's quite a long and lengthy process. Depends on what discipline you're in. But you, you don't have to write them. But if you do, there's no personal loss to you necessarily other than time in the day.
Yeah.
And that's a valuable thing. The downside of that is that you don't get royalty checks bouncing in. Well, I don't. But who knows? Maybe people will put it on the shelves of, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of that thing about, what you dream about when you're growing up. And I have to, politically, you develop political opinions, right?
Yeah.
And open access publishing is a political opinion, right?
Yeah.
In the same way, including translation and English language quotations in my book is a political opinion. These are, you know, I have previously for one journal with my co-authors, there was a request to include or translate the names of organisations, and we pushed back against that. So, but these are political small p things that you do, right? But you don't dream of political opinions when you're growing up. So your life goals are not open access necessarily. It would be book on, go into Waterstones and see a copy, or go into Hodges Figgis in Dublin and see a copy on the shelf. And now I have to accept that probably won't happen. And if it did, I would be obviously thrilled, but it would be at the cost of a certain political choice. So it would be a little bit of hypocrisy there. That's a bit too harsh on myself, potentially. I've overthought these questions.
And what advice would you give to other academics or researchers who are considering publishing their books open access?
I would definitely talk to them about considering it early in the process, but not letting it deter them from what they want to say. I think that's probably one of the risks potentially for open access publishing, especially when you're writing work that has, you know, speaks to the global or speaks to other countries, or, you know, does that thing where academics frequently, not all of them, write about experiences that they're separate from. So what I would advise people is that, you know, a commitment to open access doesn't mean you need to rethink or self-edit or self-censor. Don't necessarily let it affect your work in terms of deciding not to say something. But if you are planning to do it, or you think about it and think that actually this is something you want to commit to, then do at least flag up your positionality. Positionality is obviously a big thing, as is ethical citation. You'll know this, that like ethical referencing, making sure that you don't just, you know, reference where you have a direct quotation, you know, include the like reference people work and reference the work of people who, you know, are outside that global North minority world English language lens, right? So go back, reference Tamale, go beyond Tamale, reference, you know. There's a wonderful feminist scholar called Florence Thomas, and she has only ever published in French and Spanish. But her work is so, like, she as a person is so important to feminist activisms and feminist movements in Colombia, that, you know, go back to those authors and reference from them. So take positionality seriously and include, you know, those, you know, be honest about it. So that they're kind of things I would give to someone considering open access, in terms of like what they put in the book. The practical side, I would say, explore it early, ask your library.
Always good advice.
ask the library services. It's worth asking the question because really, you know, God, I'm going to name drop Joe DeVille, but to be fair, he is like the Lancaster open access.
Yeah.
Guru? No, we don't say guru anymore, but he's, you know, all things open access. He's a source person for it. And his advice was just send the email and ask. Just see, try it. Just say, you know, if you are working on or completing a book and, you know, so there is talk of open access, just send an email and say, am I eligible? Check your eligibility. And maybe rather than... I think actually part of the message might not be for people early on in the career. Part of the message is really strongly for people later on in the career who sit on, or, you know, at the middle of the career, whatever, if we're ever going to retire. You know, people who sit on promotions panels, people who assess the research of their peers. I think my message for them would be to not discount open access, and to not deter people, if not explicitly, then implicitly. Don't think of, before you direct someone at a particular publisher because you see it as more prestigious, and I'm not going to slam publishers in this because I know it's a widening. Before you tell people, oh, you know, the gold standard is publishing with these guys,
yeah,
take a moment and think, do they publish open access? And maybe, like, the great thing I think actually about gender research, feminist scholarship, sociology, as a discipline, is that smaller publishers have been recognised as really influential. So initially my contract was with Zed, and I felt so cool because I was like, woo, Zed book. And then they were, I'm not going to knock the publisher now, Bloomsbury, because they've been really, really supportive, and were supportive of when I came, like, literally a month from when it was coming out, and said, by the way, open access. They had the setup and were really supportive of that. You know, there has been more acceptance within my own discipline of smaller publishers. And there have been, within abortion research, people, I'm going to do some name dropping here, Fiona Bloomer and Emma Campbell in Northern Ireland, and then Fiona Delandres and Mairead Enright, and their books on abortion and activism in Ireland and global abortion, and Claire Pearson's book with Fiona and Sylvia Estrella on abortion politics. They've consciously tried to make versions available without a charge.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether they've been published open access, but they've consciously... So there was already people who had started to do that, who I would like to see as, like, my peers or colleagues, or the people whose opinions I would respect as an academic. And then following kind of the Dobbs judgment, or the Roe judgment in the US, Science and Duke University Press and Verso have made this whole effort to make academic material available with no free or at open access. So I'd already been... It's worth, I think, for scholars to kind of pay attention to that. And for early career scholars, for them to pay attention to that shifting tide. But what's more important is that the people who are, confirming contracts, allocating hours, helping people to progress in their careers, recognise and encourage open access publishing, because I do think that's a major obstacle. Yeah. And it could. I'd like to think it won't, and part of me doesn't really, not really that necessarily bothered by it, but it could potentially see, just as, you know, who you publish with can affect how many people reference your work, because those publishing houses are able, their marketing and their arms and their, you know, corporate aspects are so refined. Just as publishing with one publisher can affect the reach and significance of your work, you know, I'm in a position to take that hit. My ego may not be. If in 10 years' time, but I think that, yeah, taking that risk, is it really a risk? I mean, no one's died from it, but I mean, there is a bit of a risk, and I think I would encourage the academic community to think about, as it's not as much of a risk now, to progressing those meaningful ways. That was a little bit of a ramble and a rant. Felt very much all about me.
That was extremely interesting. Thank you very much for joining us today and for talking about your experiences on the podcast. I do have one final question. Where is your book available and how can people find out more about it?
Well, so it's available through the Bloomsbury website. Yeah. There are open access links. I mean, it's available through libraries. If you search on Google, its title is there. It has a nice flag of my signature. There will be, you know, an event in Trinity College Dublin in November, and yeah, people can access the ebook online and download open access through Bloomsbury Open Press. But I'm assuming Lancaster Library are making some available to people who are registered with the library.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, if people, you know, want to have a look, that's great, but please don't tell me what you think about it. At least not to my face.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with us today.